A black pilot, fresh off a grueling transatlantic flight, eager to return home and rest, steps into the airport terminal, unaware that within minutes, everything will change. A security officer, eyes sharp with suspicion, stops him without cause, questioning his credentials, his presence, his very right to be there. The encounter escalates, humiliating him in front of stunned passengers. Just moments later, a decision is made, one that threatens his entire career. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events that no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more. It started as just another day, but it would end as something no one could ignore. There were things that Elijah Whitaker had learned to ignore, but they had not disappeared. He had learned, in his many years, to keep his gaze forward, his hands steady, his voice calm. He had learned to adjust his tie just so, to keep his uniform immaculate, to present himself, before stepping into any room, as the kind of man no one could object to. But there was always a moment, no matter how quickly it passed, when he saw it, the hesitation, the flicker of doubt in their eyes. He was the kind of man who made people reconsider their assumptions. The kind of man who carried himself with quiet dignity, a pilot's confidence, and a scholar's intellect. And yet, there were always those who seemed surprised to see him in uniform. As if, in their private understanding of the world, someone like him did not belong in the captain's seat. He had wanted to fly since he was a boy. He had grown up watching the sky, imagining the engines roaring beneath his hands, feeling the impossible weight of metal lifted by nothing but air and calculation. There was something divine about flight, about conquering the laws of the earth itself. And so, he had done what he needed to do. He had worked harder. He had excelled. He had proven himself 100 times over. And yet, despite everything, despite every accolade, every safely landed plane, every crisis handled with the efficiency of a man who understood both the sky and the weight of responsibility, there was always that hesitation. It was not loud. It was not spoken. But it was there. It was there in the passengers who peered into the cockpit and let their eyes widen before they could school their expressions. It was there in the way some of his colleagues, good men, men he had flown with for years, still seemed to measure him in ways they did not measure others. It was there in the easy camaraderie they had with each other, the jokes that passed between them that never quite included him. But Elijah had learned to ignore these things. Until that morning, the morning he met his new co-pilot. The briefing room was as ordinary as any other day. A place of routine, of clipped conversation, of focus. He entered expecting nothing more than the usual. A man beside him who knew what he was doing, who understood the weight of what they were entrusted with, who had spent years training to keep hundreds of lives safe in the air. But the man waiting for him was not just nervous. He was afraid. The young man, Patrick Dawson, had a look in his eye that was all too familiar to Elijah. It was a look that many men had before they found the words they were about to say. A look of struggle, of hesitation, of deep discomfort. "Captain," Patrick said, voice tight. He stood stiffly, as if his own body were betraying him. His hands, clenched at his sides, gave him away. Elijah nodded, extending a hand. Patrick hesitated, then shook it, too quickly, too formally. The briefing began, but something was wrong. Patrick was distracted. His mind was not on the aircraft, not on the route, not on the weather patterns they would need to navigate. It was elsewhere, tangled in something Elijah could not yet name. It was only when they sat down for coffee before departure that Patrick finally found his voice. "I can't do this," he said. His voice was low, but it was steady. He was no longer afraid. He had made his decision. Elijah set his cup down. Slowly, deliberately. "Can't do what?" Patrick's jaw tightened. His eyes were locked on the table, unable to meet Elijah's gaze. I can't fly under you," he said. I don't trust it." For a moment, there was silence, the sound of voices around them, the chatter of other pilots, of flight attendants, of ground crew preparing for another day in the sky. A world moving forward, Unaware of the storm that had just settled between them, Elijah felt something inside him shift. It was not a surprise. It was not even anger. It was something deeper, something colder, something that whispered, "So, it is still like this." Even now. He inhaled. The air was steady, but his hands curled around his cup as if to anchor himself. "And what, exactly, do you not trust?" Patrick swallowed. His face was pale. He was a man who had never had to say these words out loud before. Perhaps he had never even admitted them to himself. But now they stood between them. Unavoidable. "I don't know," Patrick said. And Elijah knew that was the truth. The man did not know. He did not understand the thing that had been placed inside him long before this moment. The thing that whispered that Elijah did not belong here. Not in this seat. Not with this responsibility. Patrick shook his head. As if trying to clear it. "It just doesn't feel right." Elijah let the silence stretch between them. Let it become heavy. Then, he stood. He did not need to argue. He did not need to explain himself. "I see," he said simply. And then he left the table, walking away from a man who had already made up his mind. This was not the first time Elijah had been met with hesitation. But it was the first time it had tried to ground him. And he would not. He could not let it. Elijah Whitaker had known silence all his life. He had known it in school, when the teacher skimmed past him during classroom discussions, never quite calling on him unless he raised his hand too many times to be ignored. He had known it at the dinner table when his father, a man of few words but many burdens, would sit staring at the wall, lost in thoughts he never spoke aloud. He had known it in the military, when the men in his squadron had accepted his presence but not his friendship. When their laughter had carried on just a little longer after he entered a room before settling into something more measured, more cautious. And now, he knew it in the cockpit. The weight of it settled between him and Patrick Dawson like turbulence before a storm. They had both been reassigned to the same flight. The airline had not removed Patrick. They had not reprimanded him. They had not even acknowledged, not in any official capacity, what he had said. Instead, the matter had been quietly handled. "Elijah," the supervisor had said, his voice calm, reasonable. "It's just nerves. You know how these young guys are. A little uncertainty, a little inexperience. Give it time. Give it time." As if time had ever been the problem. Now, seated in the cockpit, Elijah felt every second of that time stretch out unbearably. The pre-flight checks processed as they always did. Meticulous, efficient, systematic. But the air between them was poisoned with something unspoken. Patrick answered his commands with precision, but not ease. His movements were sharp, rigid. He was saying all the right things, following every protocol, and yet Elijah knew that this man did not trust him. It was one thing to suspect it. It was another to see it written plainly in a man's posture. In the way his fingers hesitated over the controls. In the way his body recoiled ever so slightly when Elijah reached across the panel. And yet, Patrick was the one who was afraid. That was the thing about men like him. About the kind of fear they carried. They had convinced themselves that it was reason. That it was instinct. That it was something other than what it was. Elijah had seen it before. Had heard it before. "It's not about race. It's just about qualifications. I just have a feeling." It had never mattered how many hours he had logged. How many flights he had commanded. How many emergencies he had handled without breaking a sweat. Because at the end of the day, men like Patrick Dawson still had the luxury of a feeling. Elijah, however, did not. The flight was routine. The sky was calm. The clouds soft. The passengers blissfully unaware of the silent war unfolding in the cockpit. Elijah had been here before. Not here exactly. Not in this moment. But in the place where a man had to prove himself all over again. Even when there was nothing left to prove. He had been here on his first flight. When the older white captain had tested him. Grilled him. Forced him to recite procedures he already knew. He had been here when a passenger, upon hearing him announce himself over the intercom, had whispered too loudly, "I didn't know they let them fly planes." He had been here every single time a colleague had been surprised. Not openly, not rudely, but in that polite, almost apologetic way. That he was as good as he was. It was a strange thing. To be excellent and still doubted. And yet, Elijah flew. The plane cut through the air, steady and sure, because Elijah had long since learned that the sky did not care. The sky did not hesitate. It did not hold its breath or second guess or wonder whether a man deserved to be there. The sky accepted all who knew how to navigate it. If only the world below could do the same. They landed without incident. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Elijah turned to Patrick. The young man had performed adequately. Not well, not poorly, just enough. Enough to get through it. Enough to avoid confrontation. Patrick did not look at him as they ran through the shutdown checklist. He did not look at him as the passengers disembarked. As the crew filtered out. As the cockpit emptied and left the two of them alone. Only then, when there was no one left to witness, did Patrick speak. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. I did my job. Elijah exhaled slowly. He had seen many men try to claim dignity in moments they had already ruined. Yes, he said, you did. But he did not say the rest. That Patrick had also betrayed himself. That he had let fear define him. That he had, in this moment, become small. Patrick hesitated as if he wanted to say something more. But in the end, he just nodded, gathered his things, and left. Elijah sat there for a long time after. Outside, the world moved on. Another crew boarded. Another flight prepared for takeoff. And Elijah? He sat in silence. Because he knew. This was not over. This was only the beginning. Elijah Whitaker was not a man who made trouble. He was not a man who raised his voice. Who demanded attention. Who spoke before weighing every word. He had long since learned that a black man in his position could not afford the luxury of anger. Even when it was justified. Even when it was burning in his chest. Tightening his throat. Threatening to spill out of him like fuel waiting for a spark. But the thing about silence, the kind of silence that had followed him all his life, was that it could be mistaken for surrender. The morning after the flight with Patrick Dawson, Elijah arrived at the airport to find himself summoned to a meeting. Not a formal inquiry, not a disciplinary action. A discussion. That was the word they used. The airline's office was polished and sterile. A place where decisions were made in hushed voices over conference tables too large for the room. The supervisor, a man named Charles Rutherford, had the kind of face that had seen too much but learned too little. His suit was crisp, his hair graying at the temples. A man who had been here long enough to believe that the system worked. Because it had always worked for him. Elijah, Rutherford said, nodding as if they were old friends. Come in, sit down. Elijah sat. He did not speak first. Rutherford exhaled, folding his hands on the table. There's been some concern. A lifetime had trained Elijah to recognize what men like Rutherford meant when they used that word. Concern. Not over what had been said. Not over what Patrick had done. Concern over how Elijah had handled it. You know how these things are. Rutherford continued, tone measured, gentle, like he was explaining a simple truth that Elijah had somehow missed. Pilots have to trust each other. They have to feel comfortable in the cockpit. Elijah let the words settle. He had heard variations of them before. It's about company culture. It's about fit. It's not about race. It's just about making sure the team works well together. He could see it now. The way they were shaping the narrative. Patrick Dawson had not been the problem. Elijah Whitaker was. Elijah, for daring to be in a position that made men like Patrick uncomfortable. Elijah, for expecting to be treated as an equal. Elijah, for refusing to look the other way. And now, here they were. The airline wouldn't punish him outright. That would be too obvious. But they would pressure him. Reassign him. Make his life difficult until he made the choice for them. This was how it had always been done. Elijah leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. I did my job, he said, his voice steady. I followed protocol. I kept the flight safe. If there's a concern, I'd like to know what it is. Rutherford studied him, choosing his next words carefully. You handled the situation, yes. But you have to understand. There's a fine balance in this industry. We can't afford tension between crew members. If a pilot feels uncomfortable, we have to take that into account. Elijah held his gaze. And what about my comfort? The words hung in the air, stark and immovable. For the first time, Rutherford hesitated. Elijah let the silence stretch. Because that was the truth. Wasn't it? They did not care if he was uncomfortable. They did not care if he had been disrespected, undermined, made to feel like a stranger in his own cockpit. The only comfort that mattered was Patrick Dawson's. Because the system had been built for men like Patrick. And men like Elijah were expected to endure. Finally, Rutherford sighed, shifting in his chair. This isn't personal, Elijah. We just want to make sure there aren't any future incidents. Incidents? Elijah almost laughed. Because there had been no incident. Only a truth spoken aloud that most men kept buried. But he saw it now. They were going to make this his fault. They were going to mark his record. Paint him as difficult, as hard to work with, as not a team player. He had seen it happen before. A black pilot raises an issue? He's stirring up trouble. A black pilot challenges a bias? He's got a chip on his shoulder. A black pilot refuses to quietly accept disrespect? He's the problem. It had always been this way. And Elijah had played their game for a long time. He had kept his head down. He had been twice as good. He had smiled and reassured and bitten his tongue when men like Patrick made careless comments. But today, he felt something shift. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the realization that no matter how much he excelled, no matter how much he earned his place, someone would always be waiting for a reason to take it from him. And maybe, just maybe, he was tired of making it easy for them. He stood, slow and deliberate. I understand, he said. If the airline has a problem with my performance, I expect to be evaluated like any other pilot. But if the only issue here is that a man doesn't want to fly with me because of his feelings, then I suggest you reconsider what kind of pilots you're hiring. Rutherford's expression darkened just slightly. Elijah, no one's questioning your abilities. Then why are we having this conversation? Silence. And there it was again. The weight of it, the proof of it. Elijah turned, heading for the door. He knew what this meant. The fights to come. The slow, deliberate attempts to push him out. The quiet warnings from colleagues who meant well but would tell him to be careful. To play it smart. But he also knew something else. The sky did not belong to Patrick Dawson. Or Charles Rutherford. Or the men who had decided, long before he was born, that someone like him should not sit in the captain's chair. The sky belonged to those who dared to claim it. And Elijah Whitaker had every intention of holding his ground. Even if it meant learning how to fight in the air. There was a particular kind of violence in the way a man could be erased without ever being touched. Elijah Whitaker had always known about that kind of violence. He had seen it happen to men like his father. Men who had worked twice as hard only to be told they had not done enough. He had seen it in the way his uncle, a teacher, had been passed over for promotions while younger, less experienced men climbed the ranks. He had seen it in the quiet resignations of men who had fought for their dignity only to find that, in the end, it had cost them everything. And now, it was happening to him. Not all at once. Not with a termination letter or a confrontation in a boardroom. No, it was slower than that. Quieter, more deliberate. At first, it was the schedules. Flights reassigned at the last minute. International routes he had long commanded, suddenly given to other captains. Red-eye shifts piling up on his roster, leaving him exhausted before he had even stepped onto the tarmac. Then came the evaluations. Nothing outright damning, just enough to build a paper trail. A note about crew cohesion. A mention of minor communication issues. Words that meant nothing but could mean everything when seen through the right lens. Then, the silence. The way conversations ended when he walked into a room. The way men he had flown with for years suddenly had nothing to say. The way he had become, without ever agreeing to it, a man standing on the outside looking in. This was how they did it. They would not fire him. They would make him want to leave. And maybe, once upon a time, he would have. Once upon a time, he would have told himself that he had done enough. That he had gone as far as the world would allow him to go. That he had fought the fight and that it was time to step aside before they took everything from him. But Elijah was not that man anymore. He had spent too many years believing that excellence was enough. That his work, his dedication, his sheer ability to command the sky would shield him from what every black man in this country already knew. That no matter how high you climbed, they would always find a way to remind you of where they thought you belonged. And Elijah had never belonged on the ground. That was what they wanted. To weigh him down with doubts, with exhaustion, with the creeping sense of isolation that had broken men before him. But what they did not understand was that Elijah Whitaker had been alone before. And he was still here. He had not survived this long just to let them decide the terms of his departure. The game had changed. And now, he was the one playing to win. It started with a phone call. A name he had not heard in years. Captain Whitaker, the voice said, warm with familiarity. It's been a long time. James Caldwell had been one of the first black captains Elijah had ever met. A man who had fought his way into the industry at a time when a black man in a pilot's uniform was still a curiosity. A spectacle, a risk. I heard what's been happening, Caldwell said, wasting no time with pleasantries. And I know exactly what they're trying to do. Elijah exhaled. You think so? I don't think, Caldwell said. I know. Because this was an old story. Men like Caldwell had lived it. Had seen promising young pilots disappear overnight. Their careers reduced to footnotes in company records. Had watched as entire lifetimes of work were dismantled by men who never had to fight for their place in the world. You've got two choices, Caldwell said. You can let them push you out. Or you can make enough noise that they have no choice but to reckon with you. Elijah leaned against the kitchen counter, staring out the window. There was a time when he would have hesitated. But that time had passed. What do you have in mind? Caldwell chuckled. Good. I was hoping you'd ask. The first thing they did was gather names. Pilots who had seen it happen before. Flight attendants who had been on the receiving end of the same silent campaign. Engineers, ground crew, mechanics, anyone who had ever been quietly shuffled aside. Who had watched their careers stall while others soared. And then, they went public. Not with accusations, not with anger, with data, with numbers, with the cold, undeniable reality of an industry that had long kept its doors half shut. They compiled records, examined hiring trends, dug into the promotions that had been quietly handed to men who had done less but looked the part. They reached out to journalists, to civil rights organizations, to anyone who would listen. And people listened. Because there was something different about Elijah's fight. He was not just a man demanding justice for himself. He was a captain, a man entrusted with lives. A man who had spent decades proving, again and again, that he was the best at what he did. And when a man like that said the system was broken, people paid attention. The backlash came quickly. Rutherford called him into another meeting. This time, there were more men at the table. Executives, lawyers. Elijah, Rutherford said, his voice carefully neutral. This isn't the way to handle this. Elijah sat back, folding his hands in his lap. How would you like me to handle it? You're making the company look bad. Another man interjected. Elijah smiled. No, he said. You are making the company look bad. There it was again. That silence. But this time, Elijah did not fill it. He let them sit in it. Let them reckon with the fact that, for the first time, a black man in their ranks was refusing to quietly fade away. You can fire me if you want, Elijah said, his voice steady, but you'd better be prepared for what happens next. Because now, the world was watching, and Elijah Whitaker was done playing by their rules. There was a particular kind of violence in the way a man could be erased without ever being touched. Elijah Whitaker had always known about that kind of violence. He had seen it happen to men like his father. Men who had worked twice as hard only to be told they had not done enough. He had seen it in the way his uncle, a teacher, had been passed over for promotions while younger, less experienced men climbed the ranks. He had seen it in the quiet resignations of men who had fought for their dignity only to find that, in the end, it had cost them everything. And now, it was happening to him. Not all at once. Not with a termination letter or a confrontation in a boardroom. No. It was slower than that. Quieter, more deliberate. At first, it was the schedules. Flights reassigned at the last minute. International routes he had long commanded. suddenly given to other captains. Red-eye shifts piling up on his roster, leaving him exhausted before he had even stepped onto the tarmac. Then came the evaluations. Nothing outright damning, just enough to build a paper trail. A note about crew cohesion. A mention of minor communication issues. Words that meant nothing but could mean everything when seen through the right lens. Then, the silence. The way conversations ended when he walked into a room. The way men he had flown with for years suddenly had nothing to say. The way he had become, without ever agreeing to it, a man standing on the outside looking in. This was how they did it. They would not fire him. They would make him want to leave. And maybe, once upon a time, he would have. Once upon a time, he would have told himself that he had done enough. That he had gone as far as the world would allow him to go. That he had fought the fight and that it was time to step aside before they took everything from him. But Elijah was not that man anymore. He had spent too many years believing that excellence was enough. That his work, his dedication, his sheer ability to command the sky would shield him from what every black man in this country already knew. That no matter how high you climbed, they would always find a way to remind you of where they thought you belonged. And Elijah had never belonged on the ground. That was what they wanted. To weigh him down with doubts. With exhaustion. With the creeping sense of isolation that had broken men before him. But what they did not understand was that Elijah Whitaker had been alone before. And he was still here. He had not survived this long just to let them decide the terms of his departure. The game had changed. And now, he was the one playing to win. It started with a phone call. A name he had not heard in years. Captain Whitaker, the voice said, warm with familiarity. It's been a long time. James Caldwell had been one of the first black captains Elijah had ever met. A man who had fought his way into the industry at a time when a black man in a pilot's uniform was still a curiosity. A spectacle. A risk. I heard what's been happening, Caldwell said, wasting no time with pleasantries. And I know exactly what they're trying to do. Elijah exhaled. You think so? I don't think, Caldwell said. I know. Because this was an old story. Men like Caldwell had lived it. Had seen promising young pilots disappear overnight. Their careers reduced to footnotes in company records. Had watched as entire lifetimes of work were dismantled by men who never had to fight for their place in the world. You've got two choices, Caldwell said. You can let them push you out. Or you can make enough noise that they have no choice but to reckon with you. Elijah leaned against the kitchen counter, staring out the window. There was a time when he would have hesitated. But that time had passed. What do you have in mind? Caldwell chuckled. Good. I was hoping you'd ask. The first thing they did was gather names. Pilots who had seen it happen before. Flight attendants who had been on the receiving end of the same silent campaign. Engineers, ground crew, mechanics, anyone who had ever been quietly shuffled aside. Who had watched their careers stall while others soared. And then, they went public. Not with accusations, not with anger, with data, with numbers, with the cold, undeniable reality of an industry that had long kept its doors half shut. They compiled records, examined hiring trends, dug into the promotions that had been quietly handed to men who had done less but looked the part. They reached out to journalists, to civil rights organizations, to anyone who would listen. And people listened, because there was something different about Elijah's fight. He was not just a man demanding justice for himself. He was a captain, a man entrusted with lives. A man who had spent decades proving, again and again, that he was the best at what he did. And when a man like that said the system was broken, people paid attention. The backlash came quickly. Rutherford called him into another meeting. This time, there were more men at the table. Executives, lawyers. Elijah, Rutherford said, his voice carefully neutral. This isn't the way to handle this. Elijah sat back, folding his hands in his lap. How would you like me to handle it? You're making the company look bad. Another man interjected. Elijah smiled. No, he said. You are making the company look bad. There it was again. That silence. But this time, Elijah did not fill it. He let them sit in it. Let them reckon with the fact that, for the first time, a black man in their ranks was refusing to quietly fade away. You can fire me if you want, Elijah said, his voice steady, but you'd better be prepared for what happens next. Because now, the world was watching, and Elijah Whitaker was done playing by their rules. Elijah Whitaker had seen it happen before. A man takes a stand, and suddenly, the ground beneath him shifts. Not all at once, not in a way that could be named outright. No, the ground erodes slowly. First, it's the assignments. The slow drip of reassignments, meant to ease him out of sight. Then, the meetings, cordial at first, but carrying the unmistakable tone of concern. Then, the calls that do not come. The emails that go unanswered. The invitations that once arrived like clockwork but now seem to have been misplaced. It is happening now, and Elijah was not surprised. He was not surprised when his schedule was filled with short-haul flights. The kind of easy, routine assignments that made sure his name disappeared from the rosters of the major international routes. He was not surprised when the invitations to leadership meetings he had once attended as a matter of course, stopped arriving. And he was certainly not surprised when he saw Patrick Dawson's name appear again and again in places where his own had once been. A man like Dawson didn't have to fight for space. The space had always belonged to him. Elijah understood now, had always understood, that men like Dawson were never the real problem. No, the real problem was the system that made room for them while quietly pushing men like Elijah out. The system was polite. It was professional. It was well-dressed and well-spoken. It never raised its voice. But it was ruthless. You need to decide how far you're willing to take this, Caldwell told him over the phone one evening. Elijah sat at his kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. I thought I already had. Caldwell chuckled. You've started a fight, brother. But finishing it, that's something else entirely. Elijah said nothing, because he knew what Caldwell meant. There were consequences for men like him who refused to go quietly. If he continued to push, they would come for more than his career. They would come for his reputation. They would start whispering that he was difficult, that he was angry, that he had become obsessed with the idea of race, that he was making things worse instead of better. They would turn him into a problem. Because that was what they did. They would not have to prove that he was wrong. They would only have to make people question whether he was right. And Elijah knew, had always known, that doubt was the easiest weapon of all. Let them come, he said finally. Caldwell sighed. That's what I thought you'd say. The airline made their next move a week later. An anonymous complaint. Our called it a review of leadership effectiveness. A few crew members had raised concerns. No one was named. No specific incidents were cited. Just concerns. Elijah sat in another meeting, across from another suited man who smiled too much and said too little. This is not disciplinary, the man assured him, flipping through the file on the table. It's just an opportunity to assess how we can improve workplace morale. Elijah almost laughed. Morale? Whose morale? Certainly not his. Certainly not the other black pilots he had spoken to in hushed voices. Men who had told him that they had seen it before. That they had been warned before. That they had learned, if they wanted to keep their jobs, not to speak at all. How long will this review take? Elijah asked. The man offered a well-practiced, meaningless smile. We'll keep you updated. Elijah knew what that meant. It meant, as long as we want it to. It meant, until you decide to leave. But Elijah did not leave. He reported for every flight. He performed every task. He walked into every room with the same quiet authority he always had. And still, the ground beneath him eroded. Still, the invitations did not come. Still, his name was not spoken. Still, he became a shadow in the place he had helped build. This was the game they played. And they were waiting for him to fold. But Elijah Whitaker was a man who had built a life in the sky. And the sky had never been kind to men who did not know how to hold their ground. It was a late flight. An overnight route he had not flown in years. A route that had been given to him as part of his review. A quiet reminder that his career was no longer in his hands. And Patrick Dawson was his co-pilot. The first time since that morning in the coffee shop. Since that confession that had started all of this. Elijah did not speak as they prepared for takeoff. And for once, neither did Patrick. There was no avoiding it now. No pretending that nothing had happened. No pretending that Patrick had not been given every privilege, every protection, while Elijah had been forced to fight just to keep what he had already earned. No pretending that the weight of history, of power, of fear and resentment, was not sitting between them. As real as the instrument panel in front of them. They lifted off in silence. The city lights fell away beneath them, swallowed by the darkness of the sky. Elijah had spent his whole life chasing that sky. And now, for the first time, he wondered if he was flying straight into a storm. There were moments in a man's life when the air itself seemed to change. When everything that had once been steady, predictable, even tolerable, shifted, as if revealing itself for what it had always been. Elijah Whitaker had spent years learning how to read the sky. He knew, before the instruments told him, when the pressure had dropped. He knew when the turbulence was coming. And he knew, had always known, that some storms did not announce themselves with lightning and rain. Some storms had been gathering long before you ever saw them coming. The cockpit was quiet. Patrick Dawson sat to his right, his hands resting on the controls with the easy familiarity of a man who had never had to fight for his place in the world. A long-haul night flight. A route Elijah had once enjoyed, back when the silence of the sky had felt like freedom. But there was no freedom in this silence. There was only the weight of something unspoken. It was Patrick who broke first. "Captain." Elijah did not look at him. "Not yet. I was surprised to see your name on the roster." Patrick continued. Elijah adjusted a switch, checked the instruments. "Why?" Patrick exhaled, something short and sharp. "I didn't think they'd keep you on." That made Elijah turn. Patrick did not meet his gaze. There it was, the thing that had been sitting between them since the beginning. The thing that Patrick had never said out loud, but had carried with him, like an old wound he had never bothered to examine. Elijah let the silence stretch. And then, finally, "Why would you think that?" Patrick shifted in his seat. He was nervous. Not like before. Not like that morning in the coffee shop when his fear had been raw, undisguised. No, this was different. This was the discomfort of a man who had been given time to justify himself, to smooth the edges of his own prejudice, to tell himself that whatever had happened, whatever he had done, had not really been about race. "I don't know," Patrick said finally. "Everything that happened, I guess I thought you'd just move on." Elijah let out a quiet laugh. Move on. As if he had been the one who started this. As if the weight of what had happened had been placed on both their shoulders. When in reality, it had only ever been placed on his. "Is that what you would have done?" Elijah asked. Patrick hesitated, because the truth was obvious. Patrick had never had to fight for a damn thing in his life. If it had been him, if someone else had refused to fly with him, the company would have handled it before he ever had to lift a finger. But men like Patrick had the luxury of pretending they had no part in the world's ugliness. Men like Patrick thought history was something they could observe from a distance, rather than something they had inherited, something they were still part of, whether they acknowledged it or not. Elijah turned back to the controls. "The thing about moving on," he said, "is that some of us don't get to choose when we do it." Patrick said nothing, because what was there to say? Nothing had happened to him. He had lost nothing. And yet, here he was, speaking like a man who had been burdened by it all. That was the thing about white guilt. It made men like Patrick feel as though they had been wounded. As though they were the ones suffering, simply because they had been forced to see the world for what it was. They flew in silence. The radio crackled. The lights of the plane blinked in the darkness. Then, a shift. Elijah felt it before he saw it. The air currents twisting. The pressure is dropping. A storm. A real one. The kind that did not care who was flying the plane. The kind that swallowed everything in its path. The turbulence hit suddenly. The plane lurched. Passengers jolted in their seats. The cockpit warning systems flickered to life. Elijah's hands moved automatically, adjusting altitude, stabilizing their path. And beside him, Patrick hesitated. For just a moment. But a moment. In the sky. Was everything. Elijah had seen it before. The way fear could paralyze a man. The way uncertainty could cost lives. The way a moment of doubt could mean the difference between falling and flying. Patrick's hands were on the controls, but his eyes flickered toward Elijah, looking for confirmation, looking for reassurance. And Elijah knew that even now, even after everything, some part of Patrick still did not trust that Elijah knew what he was doing. Some part of him still believed, deep down, that his instincts were the ones that mattered. The plane shuddered again, and Elijah did what he had always done. He took control, not because Patrick could not handle it, but because Elijah knew that at this moment, there was no room for doubt. Not his, not Patrick's, not the world's. The storm passed. The plane leveled out. The passengers would never know how close they had been to something worse. And maybe Patrick would not admit it. Maybe he would tell himself that he had never doubted Elijah at all. But Elijah had seen it, had felt it, and he knew, with a certainty sharper than anything he had ever felt before, that no matter how many flights he flew, no matter how many storms he navigated, no matter how many men he saved from themselves, there would always be another one waiting. Because the storm had never been in the sky. It had always been right here. In this country. In these men. In the unspoken belief that some people belonged in the air, and others did not. And that was the fight. The fight Elijah knew he would never stop facing. The fight that, no matter how many times he won, would never really be over. The plane touched down in the early hours of the morning. Smooth and controlled, as if nothing had happened. As if they had not been swallowed whole by the sky. As if the storm had not tested them. As if doubt had not been coiled in the air between them like a snake waiting to strike. Elijah Whitaker had landed countless planes before. This was just another flight. And yet, as they taxied toward the gate, as the engines hummed their final song, as the passengers stretched in their seats, unaware of the storm they had left behind, he felt something heavier than gravity itself pressing against him. Because he knew what came next. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when Patrick Dawson turned to him. A moment when something flickered behind his eyes. Something unsure. Something he was not yet ready to name. Good landing, he said. Elijah nodded. It was. Patrick hesitated. Then, as if he could feel the weight of it, as if he knew, in some small, unformed way, that the words would never be enough, he added, "You were right. That was all. Nothing more. No apology. No reckoning. Just that." And then Patrick was gone. Slipping into the crowd. Swallowed by the quiet chaos of the airport like a man who had already decided that the lesson was over. And maybe, for Patrick, it was. Men like him had the luxury of walking away. Elijah did not. He had expected the meeting. Rutherford was waiting, of course. His hands folded neatly on the desk. His expression carefully arranged into something neutral. Elijah sat across from him. His body still humming with the ghost of turbulence. With the weight of a fight that had never been about this flight at all. "Well done," Rutherford said. "We reviewed the reports. A challenging flight, but handled well." Elijah did not respond. Because he knew that praise from a man like Rutherford meant nothing. Knew that this was only the prelude to something else. However, Rutherford continued, with the slow precision of a man who had spent years learning how to say the worst things in the most reasonable way. "There have been ongoing concerns about the dynamics between you and certain members of the crew." Elijah exhaled slowly. There it was. Not your skill. Not your leadership. Not your record. Your presence. "That's interesting," Elijah said, "because as far as I can tell, the only dynamic that mattered last night was whether we landed safely." "And we did." Rutherford sighed, as if Elijah were the one being difficult. "This isn't about ability, Elijah. It's about cohesion. It's about trust." That word again. Trust. As if it had been Elijah who had hesitated in the cockpit. As if it had been Elijah who had needed reassurance. As if trust was something that only men like him had to earn. Again and again, while others were simply given it as their birthright. "What are you saying?" Elijah asked, though he already knew. Rutherford hesitated. Then, "The airline believes it would be best to reassign you. Just for now." Elijah leaned forward. "Reassign me to what?" A pause. Then, "A training role. A mentorship position. You'd be invaluable in helping younger pilots develop their skills. Preparing them for, quote. Elijah laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. Preparing them for what, exactly? Rutherford's face did not change. But Elijah saw it now. Saw it. They had never intended to fire him outright. No. They wanted to ground him. Wanted to keep him close enough to say they had never pushed him out. But far enough that he would never touch the sky again. They were offering him a slow death. A quiet exit. A way to disappear without making too much noise. Because that was how these things were done. Not with a fight. Not with open confrontation. With pressure. With silence. With the slow and deliberate erosion of a man's place in the world. Elijah stood. He moved slowly. Deliberately. He saw the way Rutherford watched him. Waiting to see if he would argue. If he would make it easy for them. If he would be exactly the kind of man they had already decided he was. But Elijah had learned something in the storm. Learned that there were two kinds of pilots. The kind who waited for permission to fly. And the kind who flew anyway. He looked Rutherford in the eye. His voice calm, steady. I will not be reassigned. A beat. I will not be sidelined. And then, if you want me gone, you're going to have to fire me. And if you do, I suggest you prepare for the kind of fight you've been trying to avoid. Rutherford blinked. Just once. Because now, finally, he understood. Elijah Whittaker was not asking for permission. He never had been. He was claiming what was already his. And no man at this table. No suit in this company. No polite, well-spoken agent of the system was going to take it from him. Not now. Not ever. The sun was rising when Elijah stepped out of the building. He looked up at the sky. It was still there, waiting. And so was he. Because the thing about the sky, the thing that men like Rutherford and Dawson and every other small, fearful man had never understood, was that it did not belong to them. It did not belong to anyone. It belonged to those who dared to take it. And Elijah Whittaker had always been ready to fly.